Also, it says here that there were 38 programs. Can you just, mention a few? I mean, what would some of the programs sound like the names of them?
They'll have, DC's big on acronyms, so you'll have all sorts of acronyms. SURE is one program which is, it was trying to, the U.S. Congress was trying to move away from ad hoc disaster payments in case of a flood. Payments go out and just make a permanent disaster program. SURE is one of those programs that it's eliminated. There are some export programs that their baseline is zero. Some food nutrition programs baseline zero. So it's really a gamut of various conservation programs. One is the wetland reserve program that its baseline is zero after 2012. So those, if the reauthorization of those programs or funds are not found, they will be gone.
Are there still surpluses? The term government surplus. We always used to hear about that. In fact, there were times when there was surplus peanut butter and surplus cheese, and all kinds of programs. Do we still grow a lot more than what we consume?
We still grow a lot more than we consume, but they're not government mandated surpluses or where the government would buy up a surplus. And I'm speaking of the grain, particularly. And there was a grain reserve. That program faltered because it really just messed up the marketplace. Farmers couldn't really determine what is needed, what is not needed. So we've switched to a demand-driven market. So instead of controlling supplies, we're controlling demand, and which is it gets more into the marketplace and allowing the market to decide what should be planted. So the government's not mandating surpluses. It's growers look at the market and they say, okay, I'm going to plant this many acres in corn this year, these many acres in beans, and these many acres in wheat. What determines now if we have a surplus is or not is how the demand drivers are working and also the weather conditions. And I think that's what we saw a little bit last year in the heart of the Midwest in Iowa. They had reduced yields because it was very wet in the spring, wet in the fall. And this year we had the same conditions in Ohio. We're out in the heart of the Midwest where the majority of corn is grown, had ideal conditions, and their crops are looking good right now. So you have on the supply side, it's weather dominated. On the demand side, it's exports, feeding, and other uses, fuel, etc.
You mentioned exports, and that was going to be my next question. I'm glad you brought it up, because we talked about, especially when there are famines and things going on in other countries, that we've always been called like the breadbasket of the world, more or less. Do we still export a lot of corn and wheat to other countries?
Yeah, exports are actually up in corn in total bushels. We haven't seen a total bushel decrease in exports. Exports really over the last 20 years, Dr. Fanti, have been relatively flat. They've gone up in some years, down in some years, but if you look at trend lines, it's pretty flat trend line. The issue in wheat's very similar. The U.S. exports half our wheat crop, so exports are very critical.
Half?
Yeah, half the U.S. wheat crop leaves the country.
Huh.
The dynamics are different in corn and wheat. In corn, the U.S. is the primary source of corn for the world. I think 67% of all corn exported comes from the United States, because China is the second largest producer of corn, about half of what we produce in the United States. They use much of that in country. Wheat has U.S. wheat has competition with Canada, with Europe, with Australia. Those are primary wheat countries as well, and so the export market differs from them. But from where our exports go, and that's always one of the big misnomers out there, is that if there's starvation in Africa, it's because we're using too much corn in other places. But if you look at where the corn goes, it's going to countries that feed animals. Japan has been our largest export market for corn. In fact, if Japan was its own market, it's the third largest market for corn outside of feed and ethanol. They have a feeding industry there. We also export to South Korea, Taiwan, Egypt, Mexico. Those are the top 5 areas for corn exports. And wheat it's very similar to the Southeast Asia, also the Middle East, are primary destinations for U.S. wheat.
Now, but the wheat feeds the people. Animals don't eat wheat, correct? The corn
actually,
is fed.
We are seeing some cases of wheat going into feed, even here in the United States, just from a feed cost perspective. Feeders can feed wheat because it's a protein, but you also have a quality issue. Australia last year had a lot of floods. Their wheat has always been high quality, used for milling, going into flour. Those floods really impacted the quality of wheat, and it wasn't suitable for milling, turning into flour. So it was brought into the feed market in Southeast Asia. So wheat does as a feed component. It's not as prevalent as soybean meal or corn.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I didn't realize. I know they can digest grass and all these different things, but I never thought of wheat. So I guess you do what you have to do. I mean, whenever you have a supply of.
Livestock feed animals need protein, and so you look at various protein sources to meet those needs.
So that's a fact of the day, is that we then export more than half of what we grow then. Is that what you're saying? You said that of wheat and corn?
For wheat. For corn, it's we export about 15% of
only 15. Oh, I thought you
15.
said, okay.
Wheat is 50%. Corn is 15%.
Oh, okay. I know. I thought you said 67% or something. I got the wrong figure then. Okay, so we export a lot. Now, this is part of the deal, correct? When the farmer is growing this, that is the purpose. I mean, they make money from exporting it. We don't give it away. We sell it.
Exactly. Farmers in Ohio, they'll deliver it to an elevator country, an agribusiness company that will collect the wheat. They also collect the wheat, the corn, the soybeans. Oftentimes they have contracts with buyers in other parts of the country, other parts of the world. So farmers, in some cases, very few cases, will sell directly to an export market, but most of the time they're working through a company such as Consolidated Grain and Barge down in Cincinnati, which takes it down the river system to New Orleans to be exported. So that's just one example. So, yeah, exports are there. There are some government programs, PL 480, which is a food-based program on wheat, and that's to help those countries in case of famine, in case of an emergency where they need grain. That the government will participate in that and provide commodities for some of those countries.
Okay, well, we're certainly getting a lot of information. I do, again, appreciate your staying with us. We have about 5 more minutes.
Okay.
If anybody has a question, 740-922-2700, 740-254-9000, and get your question. And this is an extremely important topic to those of us who live in Ohio, especially this part of Ohio. Actually, I was even surprised to find out how many farms. We always think of the counties around Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati. There are a lot of farms in those areas, too. And this is a huge industry. I was surprised to find out that it's the biggest industry in Ohio, farming altogether. So it's very important that we know about this, and I really feel that I did not know as much as I should have. Is there anything we didn't talk about that you want to mention? And then I have a couple other questions. We can go over the Farm Bill history, which I think is interesting to see how it evolved over the years. But is there anything you want to make sure to get in before we run out of time?
Yeah, and I think one key factor, and you mentioned ag's a very large business, and there's so many different types of agriculture in the state of Ohio, from your corn and bean farmers to your local producers that are selling at the farmers market. And I think what I want your listeners to understand is that the tent's big enough for everybody, and that one shouldn't be pitted against the other. There's needs and there's reasons for every segment. And to feed the world, you need one type of agriculture. Local markets are vital. They're fresh foods, etc. So the tent's big enough for everybody, and I think working together, it'll just be Ohio farmers, whether it's big or small, will be stronger.
You talk about the tent being big enough, and I kind of like that because it is true. I mean, we need all these different segments. But nutrition is one of my favorite topics, and I read a lot of books about it. And I am an omnivore. I eat meat. I eat everything, and hopefully in moderation. But it's the meat eaters versus the vegetarians, and the vegetarians say that the animals are ruining the environment, that it takes so much energy to raise an animal. Then the animal people who raise animals say that it's the growers of corn and soybeans and wheat that strip the topsoil of all of its nutrients and create the topsoil that's worthless topsoil. So there is a lot of bickering going back and forth. Our farming methods, and I know farmers would be hurting themselves by allowing their soil to get so depleted that they couldn't grow anything. But do you see that, we have to eat no matter how advanced we get mechanically and electronically and computers and all that. Are we going to be able to maintain our soils and all that so that we can feed our people 100 years from now, 200 years from now?
That's an excellent question, and you made one comment in the question that the farmers need that soil to continue farming, and that's the farmer's mentality is the soil is the foundation for everything, and if we don't have that good soil, we're going to be impacted. And so farming practices have changed, going to no tillage or reduced tillage, so you don't see that plow out there just plowing up the field year in and year out. It's really conserving the soil and making sure that the productivity is there. And the farming practices, and we may have touched on it the last time I was on the air with you, just how they test their soil, they map their soil to determine the nutrient needs, and they only apply the nutrients to the areas that need those nutrients. And so because the input costs of fertilizer and other nutrients are so high, you just don't want to just waste it on areas that it's not going to have any impact. And so that is key, and farmers really believe that soil, if you don't have good soil, you're not getting anything out of it. And so they recognize that we have to continue to find better ways and better methods of protecting the soil and producing a crop with the volumes that are required now and 30 years from now as the population of the world increases.
Well, and I'm glad, that makes me feel better to hear you say that, because I do, remember the pictures of the plow, nothing but dust rising from the ground, because almost like the Dust Bowl, because everything's been taken out of the soil, and we're not only feeding ourselves, but it seems now that we're feeding a good part of the world. And I'm glad to know that there's responsibility. What amazed me was, because I know that there are huge agricultural colleges all over the country, and agriculture is really a science. It's an art and a science, but it's more of a science. So our young farmers are being taught then how to conserve and preserve and make sure that it's here for future generations. That's kind of encouraging.
Absolutely, and I mentioned photosynthesis in 6th grade middle school, and you could throw in the carbon cycle in that, which is all part of that. As corn and plants are just a natural sequester of carbon, so they need carbon to grow, and by no tilling, that carbon stays in the soil and it enriches the soil. So it's yearly a sequester of carbon when crops are out there.
Well, that makes me feel better. And I really enjoyed this. I do appreciate your staying with us for the full hour. And I'd love to have you back. Maybe when you feel, give us a call, because I think you guys approached us whenever it's a relevant time to talk about things. Maybe next, spring. I don't know what, but this was really interesting.
We'd be glad to do that. Thank you.
As it gets closer to the new Farm Bill, it might be interesting to hear too, about how it's going to. When you know more about it.
Sure.
I'd love to hear more about what the changes are, and I think I'd love to keep this conversation going.
I'd love to do that as well. Thank you.